Getting way down low.
Before that fateful night, Jim Morrison was still allowed to be unpredictable, dangerous even. But in a way, the culture hadn't yet decided what was unforgivable. By early 1969, Morrison had become something larger than a rock singer. He was a symbol people projected themselves onto. Poet, shaman, rebel, sex icon, provocateur. The kind of figure audiences didn't just watch, but tested. And for a while, he passed every test. He could arrive drunk, late, hostile, incoherent, and somehow still be forgiven. The chaos felt intentional, like art. But what most people didn't understand at the time was that the line between performance and collapse had already blurred. And on one humid night in Miami, that line didn't just disappear, it snapped. The band was already fraying before they even got on the plane. The Doors were no longer the tight unit that had exploded out of Los Angeles just a few years earlier. Fame had magnified every crack. Morrison was drinking constantly, not recreationally, not socially, constantly. The kind of drinking that doesn't end the next morning. The kind that bleeds into every decision, every conversation, every silence. Ray Manzarek later described Jim during this period not as wild, but heavy. Weighted down, slower. Less interested in playing the game that had made them famous. Morrison didn't want to be a rock star anymore, but he also didn't know how to stop being one. And Miami was never supposed to be anything more than another stop on a tour that already felt cursed. John Densmore's take on Miami, from Riders on the Storm, captures the fear inside the band that night, and the sense that something had already slipped out of control before the first note was played. If only I could have melted down and hid behind my bass drum. I was small enough to fit down there. If I crouched, I didn't move. In the days leading up to Miami, Jim had been exposed to something that reignited him creatively, even as it unnerved everyone else around him. His inspiration came from seeing Julian Beck and Judith Malina's Living Theater a few nights earlier at the University of Southern California. They were a confrontational performance group that got Jim's creative juices flowing again and scared the crap out of me. Jim had gotten tickets for everybody around our office. He really wanted us to see what they were up to. Bill Siddons later explained what Jim saw in them. It was theater of confrontations, and Jim was profoundly affected by how real this made people become because, in fact, it probably best reflected what Jim was really all about. He did things to provoke people because he felt you got the person down to their nitty-gritty, and you dealt with it. At the Living Theater performance, actors wore a minimal amount of clothing, G-strings and the like, and climbed up the aisles and over the audience shouting, "No passports, no borders, paradise now." I was intimidated. Jim was elated. That influence showed up on stage almost immediately, and it was impossible to miss. "Hey, what are you all doing here? You want music? No, that's not what you really want. All right, I want to see some action up here. I want to see some people up here having some fun. I want to see some dancing. There are no rules, no limits, no laws. Come on. Won't somebody come up here and love my ass? Come on. I'm lonely up here. I need some love." He bowed his head, and I thought of Pam. Now I felt sad and embarrassed for Jim. He shouldn't show that much vulnerability. This wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. Miami was one of Jim's last attempts to get a new creative spark going and to quiet the demons that had him off-center from birth. Demons, like Lenny Bruce's, that told of a sick world in need of a comedian or an exorcist. Jim intensified his quest with existential reading, psychedelics, and alcohol. Like his romantic idols Nietzsche and Rimbaud, he glamorized death. Writing and performing seemed to be the only things that abated Jim's angst. He who knows how to breathe in the air of my writings is conscious that it is the air of the heights. A man must be built for it. Otherwise, it will kill him. Friedrich Nietzsche. Of course, neither the band nor the audience knew what Jim was up to. He hadn't told us about taking acid right before the Hollywood Bowl. And he hadn't mentioned that this night he was going to try to inject confrontational theater into our performance. Musically, the concert was the worst ever. After several attempts at playing our songs, during which someone from the audience threw a gallon of orange fluorescent day-glow paint on us. Robbie and I got up from our instruments and started to leave. The left side of the stage made a cracking noise and dropped several inches. While John experienced fear, Robbie Krieger experienced the night in a far more grounded, almost observational way. His take from Set the Night on Fire focuses on the environment itself and how everything was stacked against the band. The venue didn't help. The Dinner Key Auditorium was massive, poorly ventilated, and packed well beyond comfort. Thousands of fans were crammed together in thick, suffocating heat. Tensions were already high before Morrison even appeared. He arrived late, drunk, and agitated. Some accounts say he'd been drinking heavily all day. Others say he was already furious before he walked on stage, convinced the band and the audience were treating the show like a circus. Either way, the moment he grabbed the microphone, something felt off. Not electric, not dangerous in a thrilling way, just unstable. But to me, it seemed like just another Crazy Doors show. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching a story, you're engaging with it. And that matters more than you might think. If this episode gave you a different perspective on Jim Morrison, or made you reconsider what really happened in Miami, let me know in the comments. I read them and they genuinely shape what stories get told next. If you want to support this channel, the easiest way is just to like the video and subscribe. That helps more than people realize. And if you ever feel like going a step further, there's a super thanks option below. No pressure at all, but it does help keep these long-form, research-heavy episodes coming. Either way, thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Ray Manzarek saw the night differently still, not as a collapse, but as a deliberate confrontation that spiraled beyond control. His take from Light My Fire captures just how quickly everything unraveled. The audience didn't know what to expect, and Robbie, John, and I had no idea what Jim was planning. He never said a word about a confrontation with the Miami audience, and he certainly never said a word about taking his clothes off. And that's exactly what he tried to do on stage. He was overly fortified with alcohol. He had used the spirits to screw up his courage, but he had gone too far and was semi-sloppy drunk. But Lord, was he ranting. He was at once berating the audience for their cud-like acceptance of authority and the status quo, and at the same time imploring them to love one another and him. Love, 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 he shouted. But he also shouted, "You're all a bunch of idiots. How long are you going to let them rub your face in the crap of the earth?" He was livid and apoplectic. Maybe you like it. Maybe you love getting pushed around. And the band played like maniacs, making unearthly noises, the sounds of tormented slaves, of souls in hell. "You're all a bunch of slaves," he continued, letting everybody push you around. "What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it?" He said it over and over and over, as if he had gone insane, screaming a mantra to himself, to the world, and maybe even to God. What are you going to do about it? And we crashed on our instruments as the audience surged forward, pushing and shoving against the rickety scaffolding stage. I felt the stage begin to list. It was going to go. I knew it was only a matter of time. We were in a near riot situation, and quite frankly, I loved it. It was Jim at his drunken best. If he was going to be a rummy, at least this was a boozer with something to say, even if he was completely mad. John, of course, hated it, but he stuck it out to the bitter end. Then, Jim's mood shifted again, as suddenly as it had darkened, and he was talking about love. I'm not talking about no revolution. I'm not talking about no demonstration. I'm not talking about no riot in the streets. I'm talking about dancing. I'm talking about love your neighbor. I'm talking about grab your friend. I'm talking about love. Love, love, love. And so it went, back and forth, between love and hate. At one point, Jim dropped a clue as to what had inspired the chaos. Now listen, the last couple of nights, I met some people who were doing something. They're trying to change the world, and I want to get on the trip. I want to change the world. There are no rules. There are no laws. Do whatever you want to do. Be free. From management's perspective, The damage wasn't the act itself, but what followed. Later, Bill Siddons was asked what really happened in Miami in an interview with Frank Lisiandro. Miami was a totally planned event, but he didn't have any concept of where he was or what reaction it was going to get. He was drunk. He was not in total control of his faculties, and he essentially aped the living theater. He loved what they were doing and thought, that's what's missing in my life. I want that kind of performance. But for what end? He wanted to make the audience think. He didn't want them to just get off. So he went on stage in Miami and tried to make the audience think. It wasn't entirely successful. It wasn't a disaster creatively, but it was a disaster musically. He did something he meant to turn a corner with. He just didn't know which corner he was turning. I think he walked on stage thinking, if I can integrate some of this power into what I do, it will make me believe in what I do again. Instead, he ended up being put out of business for it and branded a freak and a pervert. That's what broke his spirit. It was the reaction to the Miami thing. As the rumors grew, one person was in a position to know exactly what did and did not happen on stage. Vince Traynor later addressed the most controversial claim from that night in his interview with Frank Lisiandro. No, Ray wasn't taking a chance, and neither was I. Ray yelled at me, Vince, don't let him take his pants down. So I walked up behind him, grabbed his pants, and held them up. He never touched his belt. He never touched his fly. He never made an attempt to pull his pants down. Jim wasn't stupid. Every move he made, he knew what he was doing. It was spontaneous, but he had a plan. He took one direction and went. And then when it was advantageous to turn, he turned. And you never know where the path led. Jim didn't either. But he was leading the way, and the band followed. Here's a different story from someone close to Jim. Ginny Gannell, who worked as a secretary at the Doors office, relayed this story to Frank Lisiandro. She said she doesn't remember exactly whether this happened during one conversation or two, but Jim made a comment about Miami, and she responded by mentioning the act, whatever it was he was accused of doing. Jim reacted with mock horror in his voice and said, Ginny, you know I would never do anything like that. She isn't sure whether what followed came from that same conversation or another one later, because the topic came up more than once. That night in Miami, Jim had met a woman named Bonnie, who later came out to Los Angeles. Ginny and Bonnie became friends, and Frank confirms that Bonnie was an attorney, which Ginny also agrees with. Because of that, Ginny says she and Jim talked about Bonnie and the Miami situation more than once. On one of those occasions, Jim explained that his job as an entertainer was to hold up a mirror to the audience. He chuckled and said, man, that was one ugly audience. Ginny says that to her, it felt like Jim was partly owning the intent of what happened. He never directly told her that he did not expose himself, and he never directly admitted that he did. Bonnie, however, told Ginny that he did. Inside the band, panic set in. Ray tried to pull the music back on track. Robbie focused on his guitar. John watched Jim closely, sensing the situation slipping out of control. Morrison wasn't leading the band anymore. He was daring it to abandon him. When the show ended, there was no release, no sense of surviving another wild Jim Morrison moment. Only silence, confusion, and the feeling that something irreversible had just happened. The backlash was swift and merciless. Headlines exploded across newspapers and television broadcasts, reducing a complex, chaotic night to a handful of scandalous words. Politicians condemned Morrison publicly, eager to be seen taking a moral stand. Religious groups organized protests and demanded consequences. Radio stations quietly pulled the Doors from rotation. Promoters canceled shows, sometimes without explanation, sometimes with thinly veiled fear of controversy. The thing that had once made Jim Morrison untouchable, his refusal to conform, his willingness to provoke, became the justification for destroying him. Charges were filed. Court dates were scheduled. Lawyers circled. The mythology cracked. Jim Morrison was no longer a misunderstood poet or dangerous genius. He was a liability, a headline, a problem no one wanted to defend. What made Miami matter wasn't just what happened on stage. It was what happened afterward. For the first time, the industry didn't close ranks around Morrison. The label distanced itself. Promoters hesitated. Journalists who once celebrated his unpredictability began framing it as sickness or self-destruction. Even fans were divided. Some insisted it was all blown out of proportion. Others quietly stepped away, uncomfortable with how real it had suddenly become. And Jim felt the shift immediately. The love that once seemed unconditional now came with terms. The forgiveness he had always relied on suddenly had limits. Friends noticed the change almost at once. Morrison became withdrawn, suspicious, and increasingly obsessed with the trial hanging over his head. Conversations that once revolved around music drifted toward escape. Poetry, film, Europe, anywhere but here. He talked about leaving America as if it were no longer home. He grew a beard, gained weight, and seemed to deliberately erase the image that had once defined him, as if daring the world to recognize him without the myth. Some saw it as defiance. Others saw exhaustion. Most likely, it was both. The trial dragged on, a public spectacle that forced Morrison to sit quietly while strangers debated his character, his intent, his body. He was convicted, sentenced, suddenly facing prison time. For a man who had always lived as if consequences were theoretical, this was different. This was real, and it terrified him. The bravado that once protected him evaporated. In its place came anxiety, self-doubt, and the creeping realization that America might be finished with him. The Doors kept recording, they kept touring. On the surface, the machine kept moving. But something fundamental was gone. The music still worked, but it carried a different weight. Jim's voice deepened, slowed, as if carrying everything he couldn't say out loud. The wild theatricality gave way to something more inward, more reflective. Albums like Morrison Hotel and L.A. Woman sounded less like rebellion and more like reckoning. The Miami incident hadn't killed Jim Morrison's talent. It had forced it inward. By the time Morrison left for Paris, it didn't feel like a vacation. It felt like exile. He told friends he wanted to write, to disappear, to live anonymously, free from the persona that had swallowed him whole. Miami had shown him something he couldn't unsee, that the character he had created was no longer under his control. Once that realization sets in, there is no way back. Miami wasn't the night Jim Morrison went too far. It was the night everyone else decided they'd had enough. And from that moment on, the clock started ticking, not toward redemption, not toward reinvention, but toward disappearance.